I watched my daughter-in-law's smile fade the exact second the lawyer read that one sentence, and in that moment, I knew my husband had seen everything long before I did. The room was too quiet for a space filled with people, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel deliberate, measured, controlled. I sat at the end of the polished oak table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I had folded them at church, at dinners, at every moment in my life when I chose dignity over reaction. Across from me, Vanessa leaned slightly toward Daniel, her fingers resting lightly on his arm as if she already belonged to everything in that room, as if she had already won. Daniel didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me much in the past week, not since the funeral, not since we buried his father under a sky so blue it felt almost offensive. He kept his eyes on the documents in front of the lawyer, nodding occasionally, as though this were just another business meeting, another transaction to finalize. Harold Green cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses with the same careful precision I remembered from years ago when Edward first introduced us. "We'll begin with the formal reading," he said, his voice calm, neutral, professional. Vanessa smiled then, a small, satisfied curve of her lips, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I had seen that smile before, though I hadn't understood it at the time. Not fully, not until it was too late. 3 days earlier, the house had still smelled like Edward's cologne. It lingered in the hallway, in the bedroom, in the quiet spaces between memories. I woke up that morning alone, the sunlight slipping through the curtains in thin, pale lines, and for a moment, I forgot. For a moment, I reached across the bed, expecting to find him there. My hand met nothing but cool sheets. Downstairs, I found Vanessa already in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee, her posture straight, composed, as if she had always belonged there. "You should really think about downsizing," she said without looking at me, her tone casual, almost conversational. I remember pausing in the doorway, my fingers still wrapped around the banister. "This house is too much for one person," she added, finally turning, her eyes scanning me in a way that felt less like concern and more like calculation. Daniel stood beside her, silent, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder. "We've talked about it," she continued, placing her cup down with a soft, deliberate click. "It makes sense." I nodded slowly, though something inside me had already begun to shift, something quiet and cold and undeniable. I had spent 42 years in that house. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light in the late afternoon, every memory stitched into the walls. And yet, standing there, I felt like a guest. No, not even that. Something less. That afternoon, I passed by the study and heard voices through the half-closed door. Vanessa's voice, low and certain. "We just need to move quickly," she said, "before she starts asking questions." There was a pause, then Daniel's voice, softer, hesitant. "She won't," he replied. "She never does." I stood there longer than I should have, my hand resting against the doorframe, my breath slow and steady. I didn't interrupt. I didn't confront them. I simply listened, letting the truth settle into place piece by piece, like a puzzle I had been too trusting to solve before. Back in the lawyer's office, I could still hear those words echoing in my mind as Harold turned the page. Vanessa shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, her heel tapping lightly against the floor in quiet anticipation. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his shoulders tense, his expression focused. They were waiting for confirmation, for ownership, for the final step in a plan they believed was already complete. I remained still. I said nothing. I simply waited. Because unlike them, I already knew something they didn't. And in just a few seconds, they would hear it too. I kept my eyes on the lawyer as he adjusted the papers in front of him, but my mind drifted back to the small, quiet moments that had led me here, the ones I had once dismissed as grief or misunderstanding, the ones that now felt like carefully placed steps in a plan I had never been meant to see. The morning after I overheard them in the study, I woke earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that heavy, unfamiliar silence that follows loss. I made my way downstairs slowly, my hand gliding along the wall as if I needed to remind myself that the house was still real, still mine, at least for that moment. The kitchen was empty, but something felt different. Subtle, almost invisible, but there. The fruit bowl that had always sat in the center of the table was gone. The framed photo of Edward and me from our 30th anniversary had been moved from the counter to a shelf near the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of cookbooks. I stood there for a long time, staring at that photograph, noticing how easily it had been displaced, how quickly something meaningful could be pushed aside to make room for something else. Footsteps echoed softly behind me, and Vanessa entered without greeting, already dressed, already composed. She moved past me as if I were part of the furniture, opening cabinets, rearranging items, making small adjustments that seemed insignificant on their own but, together, told a very different story. "We are having the real estate agent come by this afternoon," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. I turned slowly. "The real estate agent?" I repeated, my voice calm, steady, even though I could feel something tightening deep inside my chest. She nodded, reaching for a notepad on the counter. "Just to get an idea of the property value," she said. "It is better to be prepared." Daniel appeared in the doorway then, his tie slightly loosened, his expression unreadable. He did not contradict her. He did not look at me. He simply walked to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup, and stood there in silence, as though this conversation had nothing to do with him, as though I had already been removed from the equation. I remember nodding again, the same slow, measured movement, the same quiet acceptance they had come to expect from me. "Of course," I said. "Preparation is important." Vanessa smiled at that, a quick flash of satisfaction that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. She believed I was agreeing. She believed I did not understand, and I let her believe that. That afternoon, I did not stay for the meeting with the agent. Instead, I went upstairs to the bedroom Edward and I had shared for over 4 decades. I opened his closet and ran my fingers along the row of neatly pressed shirts, each one exactly where he had left it. There was comfort in that order, in the idea that some things had not yet been touched, not yet rearranged, not yet claimed by someone else. On the top shelf, tucked behind a box of old documents, I found the envelope he had shown me only once, years ago, when we first discussed what would happen someday. He had smiled then, that quiet, knowing smile of his, and said, "Everything is taken care of, Margaret. You will never have to worry." At the time, I had believed him without question. Standing there now, with the house shifting around me and voices downstairs discussing square footage and market trends, I realized he had not just been reassuring me. He had been preparing for something I had refused to imagine. I did not open the envelope. Not yet. Instead, I placed it back exactly where I had found it, my movements careful, deliberate. Some things were better revealed at the right moment. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house filled with long shadows, Daniel knocked softly on my door. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the frame, his posture uncertain. "Mom," he began, his voice quieter than I had heard it in years. "We are just trying to do what is best." I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the boy I had raised, the one who used to reach for my hand without hesitation. I did not find him. Instead, I saw someone else, someone distant, someone convinced of something that did not include me. I nodded once more, offering him the same calm expression I had given all day. "I know," I said softly, and I meant it. They were doing what they believed was best, for themselves. Back in the lawyer's office, Harold finally lifted his gaze from the document, his eyes moving from Daniel to Vanessa, then settling briefly on me. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something almost like recognition, as though he understood more than he was saying. He turned the page slowly, the sound of paper against paper echoing louder than it should have in that quiet room. Vanessa leaned forward, her anticipation no longer hidden, her confidence filling the space between us. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly, as if the outcome was already certain. I remained still, my hands resting gently in my lap, my posture unchanged. Because I had seen the pieces come together. I had heard the plan before it was complete. And now, as the lawyer prepared to speak again, I knew exactly which moment Edward had been waiting for all along. The lawyer's voice was steady when he began again, but there was a subtle shift in the room that no one else seemed to notice, a quiet tension that settled beneath the surface like something waiting to rise. "As per the final amendment to the will," Harold said, his tone precise, each word measured, deliberate. "All primary assets, including the residence, financial accounts, and investments, are to be transferred under specific conditions. Vanessa's posture straightened immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table, her attention sharpening in a way that revealed more than she intended. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, his focus fixed on the document as though he could will the outcome into existence. I watched them both without moving, without reacting, the same calm expression resting on my face, even as I felt the weight of Edward's foresight unfolding in front of us. Harold paused for a brief moment, adjusting his glasses again, his eyes flicking toward me before returning to the page. The beneficiary structure, he continued, remains unchanged in designation. However, distribution is contingent upon compliance with the following clause. The word compliance seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the rest, as if it carried a meaning they had not prepared for. Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly, a nearly invisible crack in her confidence, but it was there. I saw it. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his fingers interlocking as though he needed something to hold on to. I remained still, my hands folded, my breathing slow and even, my thoughts clear in a way they had not been in days. 3 nights before, I had sat alone in the living room after they had gone to bed, the envelope resting quietly on the table in front of me. The house had been silent, the kind of silence that feels complete, uninterrupted, as though the walls themselves are listening. I opened it then, carefully, the paper inside crisp and untouched, Edward's signature unmistakable at the bottom of the page. I read every line slowly, my eyes tracing each word, each condition, each carefully constructed sentence that revealed just how much he had understood, how much he had anticipated. He had not raised his voice. He had not accused. He had simply written the truth into permanence. Back in the present, Harold cleared his throat softly, preparing to continue, but the pause had already done its work. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the air itself had shifted. Vanessa leaned closer to Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper, but in the quiet space, it carried just enough. "What does that mean?" she asked, her tone controlled, but no longer certain. Daniel did not respond immediately. He kept his eyes forward, his expression focused, but there was something else there now, something uncertain, something unsettled. I lowered my gaze briefly, not out of submission, but to hide the quiet understanding that had already taken root within me. This was the moment Edward had prepared for. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with patience. Harold resumed, his voice calm, unwavering. "Any listed heir who attempts, directly or indirectly, to remove Margaret Whitmore from the primary residence, or to alter her living conditions without her explicit consent, shall be considered in violation of the terms set forth in this will." The words landed with a clarity that required no interpretation. Vanessa froze, completely. Her hand, which had been resting on the table, stilled as though time itself had paused. Daniel's head lifted slightly, his eyes shifting from the document to the lawyer, then, slowly to me. For the first time since the funeral, he looked directly at me. Truly looked. I met his gaze without changing my expression, without offering him anything more than the calm, steady presence he had mistaken for weakness. Harold continued, his tone unchanged. "In such an event, said heir shall forfeit all claims to the estate, including but not limited to property, financial holdings, and any future distributions." The silence that followed was absolute. No shifting, no movement, just the quiet, undeniable weight of consequence settling over the room. Vanessa's composure broke first, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the smallest of ways, a sharp inhale, a flicker of disbelief that crossed her face before she could contain it. Daniel leaned back slowly, his shoulders no longer tense with expectation, but heavy with something else entirely. Understanding. I did not speak. I did not need to. Instead, I simply adjusted my hands in my lap, lifting my chin ever so slightly, allowing the truth to exist exactly as it was. Because this had never been about winning. It had always been about revealing what had already been decided long before any of us walked into that room. No one spoke for several seconds after the lawyer finished reading that clause, but the silence said more than any argument ever could. Vanessa was the first to move, her hand sliding off the table as if the surface had suddenly become unstable, her posture shifting from composed to uncertain in a way she could not fully control. She let out a quiet breath, forcing a small laugh that did not sound natural, did not sound convincing, even to her. "That seems a little extreme," she said, her voice carefully measured, but thinner than before, as though the confidence she had been holding onto was beginning to slip through her fingers. Harold did not respond immediately. He simply adjusted the document, turning another page with the same steady precision, as if nothing unusual had happened. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on the table, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers pressed together more tightly than before. He understood. Maybe. Not everything yet, but enough. I shifted slightly in my chair, a small movement that seemed to draw their attention without me saying a single word. Vanessa glanced at me then, really looked at me for the first time since we entered the room, and I saw something new in her eyes. Not irritation, not dismissal, something closer to calculation, mixed with the first hint of doubt. She straightened again, her voice regaining a layer of control. "Well," she said, turning toward the lawyer, "that is not really relevant, is it? We have not done anything like that." Her words were quick, almost rehearsed, but the timing betrayed her. Too fast, too defensive. Harold finally lifted his gaze, his expression neutral, but firm. "The clause is standard within the context of this document," he replied calmly. "Its relevance depends entirely on the actions taken by the listed heirs." The room fell quiet again. I lowered my eyes briefly, letting my hands rest gently against each other, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breath. I did not need to look at them to know what they were thinking. I had heard enough already. I had seen enough in the past few days to understand the direction they had chosen long before we ever sat in this room. My mind returned, briefly, to the afternoon when Vanessa stood in the hallway speaking on the phone, unaware that I was just around the corner. "She will not fight it," she had said, her voice confident, certain. "She never does. We will have the house listed within a week." I had stood there quietly, my hand resting against the wall, listening without interruption, without reaction. Not because I agreed, not because I did not care, but because I was finally beginning to understand that silence could be more powerful than confrontation. Back in the office, Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but lacking the certainty he had carried earlier. "So what exactly does this mean going forward?" he asked, his eyes lifting toward the lawyer, though he avoided looking at me. Harold folded his hands neatly over the document. "It means," he said evenly, "that any decision regarding the residence or Mrs. Whitmore's living arrangements must involve her direct consent. Any attempt to proceed otherwise would trigger the forfeiture clause." Vanessa's lips pressed together, her expression tightening for just a moment before she forced it back into something more neutral. "Of course," she said quickly. "We would never make a decision like that without including her." The words sounded polite, reasonable, but they did not match what I had heard. They did not match what I had seen. I lifted my gaze then, meeting her eyes briefly, offering a small, calm nod, the same gesture I had given her so many times before. The same gesture she had mistaken for agreement, for weakness, for absence. But this time, it meant something else entirely. It meant I understood. It meant I remembered. It meant I was no longer the person she thought I was. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his posture no longer confident, no longer certain. He glanced at Vanessa, searching for reassurance, but she did not meet his eyes. For the first time since this began, they were not perfectly aligned. The quiet partnership they had relied on was beginning to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my shoulders relaxed, my expression unchanged. Because I did not need to push. I did not need to argue. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, already been signed, already been placed into motion long before any of us realized where this was going. And now, all that was left was for them to sit with it, to understand it, to realize that the outcome they had been so certain of was no longer theirs to claim. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms slowly as if she needed to physically hold herself together, her eyes no longer fixed on the lawyer but drifting, calculating, searching for a way to regain control of a situation that had quietly slipped beyond her reach. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," she said after a moment, her tone softer now. less assertive, but still trying to maintain authority. We have only been discussing possibilities. Nothing has been decided. Her words hung in the air, carefully chosen, but they felt hollow, disconnected from the reality that had already been exposed. Harold did not interrupt. He simply waited, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the weight of what had already been said to settle more deeply. Daniel shifted beside her, his shoulders tense, his gaze moving between Vanessa and the lawyer, as if he were trying to align himself with whichever version of the truth would leave him standing. I watched him quietly, noticing the hesitation in his movements, the uncertainty that had begun to replace the quiet confidence he carried into this room. It reminded me of a much younger version of him, the boy who used to look to me for reassurance when he was unsure of himself. But that boy was not here now. Or perhaps he was, buried somewhere beneath the choices he had made. "We are not accusing anyone of wrongdoing," Harold said calmly, his voice steady and even. "The clause exists to ensure that Mrs. Whitmore's position remains protected under all circumstances." Vanessa nodded quickly, too quickly, as if agreeing would somehow neutralize what had already been established. "Of course," she replied, "and we respect that. Completely." I lowered my gaze slightly, allowing a small pause to pass before I spoke for the first time since the reading began. "I am glad to hear that," I said quietly, my voice calm, measured, and unmistakably present. The effect was immediate. Vanessa's eyes snapped back to me, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed it over again. Daniel turned as well, his face reflecting something closer to discomfort now, as if hearing me speak had forced him to acknowledge something he had been trying to avoid. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I did not need to. My presence alone, steady and unshaken, was enough to shift the balance in the room. Harold inclined his head slightly, acknowledging my words, before continuing. "There is an additional provision," he said, turning another page with deliberate care. Vanessa's posture stiffened again, her attention snapping back to the document, her earlier composure replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "Additional," she repeated, unable to fully hide the tension in her voice. Harold nodded. "Yes, a secondary safeguard, intended to clarify authority in the event of any dispute regarding interpretation of the will." Daniel leaned forward again, his brows furrowing, his focus narrowing as if he could anticipate what was coming next. I remained still, though I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle deeper within me. I had read this part already. I knew what Edward had written. I knew why he had written it. And more importantly, I understood exactly when it was meant to matter. In the event that any conflict arises concerning the execution of these terms, Harold continued, final discretionary authority shall rest solely with Mrs. Whitmore. The words were simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Vanessa's breath caught slightly, the smallest break in her carefully controlled demeanor, but it was enough. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, searching for something, perhaps support, perhaps reassurance, but he did not respond immediately. He was still processing, still trying to reconcile the outcome he expected with the one now unfolding in front of him. "Meaning," Harold added, his tone unchanged, "all decisions regarding the estate, including timing, conditions, and any potential sale of property, require her approval." The silence that followed was no longer just tension. It was realization. Vanessa's fingers tightened against her arm, her posture rigid, her mind clearly moving through possibilities that were rapidly narrowing. Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his expression no longer guarded but openly unsettled. I lifted my chin slightly, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had always been true. Edward had not left anything unfinished. He had not left anything to chance. He had seen what I had refused to see, and he had made sure that, when the moment came, I would not have to fight to be heard. Because my voice had already been written into the outcome long before this room, long before this day, long before they ever believed they had control. Vanessa's composure did not shatter all at once. It unraveled slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a thread being pulled loose 1 inch at a time, her fingers tightening around her arm before she forced them to relax, her shoulders lifting slightly as she drew in a controlled breath, as if she could steady herself through sheer will alone. "So," she began carefully, her voice smoother now, but no longer confident. This just means everything needs to go through Margaret first. She said my name with a precision that felt unfamiliar, as though she were adjusting to a new reality she had not planned for. Harold inclined his head slightly. That is correct. Daniel exhaled beside her, a long, quiet breath that seemed to carry the weight of realization, his posture shifting as he leaned forward again, his hands clasped together now instead of resting loosely, his body language no longer that of someone expecting to receive, but of someone trying to understand what had already been decided without him. I watched them both in silence, my hands still folded neatly in my lap, my back straight, my expression unchanged. I did not need to interrupt. I did not need to guide the conversation. Everything was already moving exactly as it needed to. Vanessa turned slightly toward Daniel, her voice dropping just enough that it was meant to be private, but not quiet enough to escape the stillness of the room. "We can work with that," she said, her tone low, measured, but urgent beneath the surface. "It is not a problem. We just need to be careful." Daniel did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the table, his jaw tightening again as if the effort to maintain control was becoming more difficult with each passing moment. "Careful about what?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than before, lacking the certainty it once carried. Vanessa hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "About how we move forward," she said. "That is all." I lowered my gaze slightly, allowing the faintest pause to settle between their words and the space around them. "Careful." The word echoed in my mind, not because it was new, but because I had heard it before. 2 nights earlier, in the hallway, when she thought I was asleep, when she believed the house belonged entirely to her and her plans. "We just have to be careful," she had said into her phone, her voice quiet but firm. "Once everything is transferred, it will not matter." I had stood there in the dark, listening without moving, without reacting, letting each word settle into place with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. Back in the office, I lifted my head again, my gaze steady as it moved from Vanessa to Daniel, then briefly to Harold, who remained composed, patient, waiting for the conversation to reach its natural conclusion. "There is no need to rush anything," I said softly, my voice even, calm, but carrying a quiet certainty that filled the room in a way volume never could. Both of them looked at me immediately. Vanessa's expression tightened again, her lips pressing together before she forced them into something resembling a polite smile. Daniel's eyes lingered on mine a moment longer, searching, uncertain, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "Of course," Vanessa replied quickly. "We would never rush you." The words sounded right. Respectful. Considerate. But they arrived too quickly, too perfectly, as though they had been chosen in advance, waiting for the moment they would be needed. I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging her response without challenging it, without accepting it fully either, because I understood now that words were only part of the story. Actions had already spoken far more clearly. Harold gathered the documents neatly, aligning the pages with careful precision before setting them down in front of him. "If there are no further questions," he said, his tone calm and professional, "we can proceed with the formal acknowledgments." Vanessa straightened again, her posture returning to something more controlled, though the tension had not left her entirely. Daniel sat back slightly, his hands resting against his knees now, his shoulders no longer rigid, but not relaxed either. I remained exactly as I was, still, composed, present, because for the first time since Edward was gone, I did not feel uncertain. I did not feel displaced. I did not feel like a guest in my own life. I felt grounded, anchored, certain in a way that did not require explanation. Vanessa reached for a pen, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as though she were aware that every action carried weight she could not yet measure. Daniel followed, signing where indicated, his expression thoughtful, subdued. When the pen was placed in front of me, I took it without hesitation, my hand steady as I wrote my name, each letter clear, precise, undeniable. Margaret Whitmore. I set the pen down gently, lifting my gaze once more, meeting their eyes not with defiance, not with triumph, but with something far quieter, something far stronger. Understanding. Because this had never been about taking something from them. It had been about making sure they could not take anything from me ever again. We left the lawyer's office without another word, the quiet of the hallway wrapping around us like a final acknowledgement that something irreversible had just taken place, something none of us could pretend had not happened. Vanessa walked slightly ahead, her steps measured but faster than usual, her posture rigid as though she were holding herself together by force alone. Daniel lingered a step behind her, his pace slower, uncertain, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he were trying to retrace something he had missed along the way. I walked beside them, not ahead, not behind, simply present, my movements steady, my breathing even, my thoughts clearer than they had been in years. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, the lights soft but unyielding, revealing every detail without mercy. Vanessa reached the car first, pausing briefly before opening the door, her hand resting on the handle for just a moment longer than necessary. Daniel stopped beside her, glancing in my direction, then away again, as though he wanted to say something but could not yet find the words. I did not offer them. I did not fill the silence. I simply waited. Vanessa finally turned, her expression carefully composed, but no longer effortless. "We should head back," she said, her tone controlled, almost neutral, as though nothing significant had changed. I nodded once. "Of course," I replied softly. The drive was quiet, not tense in the way arguments create tension, but heavy in a different way, like a space that had been filled with assumptions now left empty, waiting to be understood. Vanessa kept her eyes on the road, her grip on the steering wheel slightly tighter than usual, her posture upright, focused, but not relaxed. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed ahead, his silence no longer indifferent, but thoughtful. I sat in the back, looking out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, each one carrying memories that felt sharper now, more defined, as though something had shifted not just in the present, but in how I understood the past. When we arrived at the house, Vanessa stepped out quickly, moving toward the front door without waiting, her movements efficient, purposeful, as if she needed to regain control of something, anything, as soon as possible. Daniel lingered again, closing the car door more slowly, his hand resting briefly on the roof before he turned toward me. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice hesitant, unfamiliar in its uncertainty. I looked at him, meeting his gaze fully, without anger, without accusation, but without softness either. Just clarity. He hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly, as though he were searching for the right words and finding none that felt sufficient. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice low, almost defensive, but not quite. I held his gaze for a moment longer before responding. "You did not ask," I said calmly. The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. He inhaled slowly, his shoulders lifting and falling with the breath, his expression shifting in a way that suggested understanding, or at least the beginning of it. Vanessa opened the front door then, her voice calling back without turning around. "Are you coming?" Daniel straightened slightly, glancing once more at me before stepping forward, following her inside. I entered last, the familiar scent of the house greeting me, unchanged despite everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed. The living room was exactly as I had left it that morning, the furniture in place, the light filtering through the windows in the same soft pattern, but it felt different now. Not because anything had been taken, but because something had been returned. A sense of place, of ownership, of presence. Vanessa moved into the kitchen, opening cabinets, shifting items, her movements sharper now, less fluid, as though the ease she once carried had been replaced by something more deliberate. Daniel stood near the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain, watching without intervening. I walked past them both, my steps unhurried, making my way to the living room, where Edward's chair still sat near the window, exactly where he had left it. I paused beside it, resting my hand lightly on the back, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingers. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember, not with sadness, not with longing, but with a quiet recognition of everything he had seen, everything he had understood, everything he had prepared without ever needing to explain it out loud. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa's voice again, lower now, sharper, speaking to Daniel in quick, controlled sentences I could not fully make out, but I did not need to. The tone was enough. The shift was enough. I remained where I was, my hand resting on the chair, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting. I was not adjusting. I was not stepping aside. I was simply standing exactly where I belonged, knowing that whatever came next would no longer be decided without me. The house settled into a quiet rhythm that evening, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was sharper now, more aware, like every wall had begun to listen more closely, like every step carried weight that could no longer be ignored. Vanessa moved through the kitchen with a kind of forced precision, opening and closing drawers, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, her movements quick, controlled, but edged with something she could not fully hide. Daniel remained near the doorway for a long time, watching her, his silence no longer passive but reflective, as though he were beginning to see patterns he had once overlooked. I stayed in the living room, seated now in Edward's chair, my hands resting lightly on the armrests, my posture relaxed but steady, my gaze directed toward the window where the last light of the day slowly faded. I did not rush to speak. I did not interrupt the quiet. I allowed it to unfold, because silence had already revealed more than words ever had. After a while, Vanessa stepped into the living room, her expression composed again, though the effort behind it was visible now in the slight tension around her eyes. She stopped a few feet from me, crossing her arms loosely, as if trying to appear casual. "We should talk about next steps," she said, her tone measured, but no longer confident. I looked at her, not immediately, but after a brief pause, as though I were considering whether the conversation was necessary. "Next steps," I repeated softly. She nodded. "Yes, about the house, about arrangements." The word lingered, unfinished, as though she was testing how far she could go without overstepping. I tilted my head slightly, studying her in a way I had not allowed myself to before, noticing the small details I had once ignored, the careful choice of words, the subtle shifts in tone, the way she positioned herself just slightly above others in conversation, as though authority had always been assumed, not earned. "There is nothing to arrange," I said calmly. The simplicity of the sentence seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked once, her posture tightening. "I think there is," she replied, her voice firmer now, though still controlled. "We all need to be practical." Practical. The word echoed in the room, familiar, used before in moments where decisions were made without me, where outcomes were discussed as though I were not part of them. I nodded once, slowly. "I agree," I said. "We should be practical." She relaxed slightly at that, mistaking agreement for alignment, her shoulders lowering just enough to suggest she believed the conversation was returning to her terms. "Good," she said. "Then we can start by—" "We will start," I interrupted gently, my voice still calm, still even, but firm in a way that left no space for misunderstanding, with what has already been decided. The room shifted, not physically, but in something less visible, something deeper. Vanessa's expression stilled, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she tried to understand the meaning behind my words. Daniel stepped closer then, his presence quieter, but more engaged than before, his attention fixed on me now rather than the space between us. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. I rested my hands together in my lap, my posture unchanged, my gaze steady. "Your father made his intentions very clear," I said, "and I intend to honor them." Vanessa exhaled slowly, her patience thinning, her control slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. "We are not trying to go against that," she said quickly. "We just need to find a way to move forward that works for everyone." Everyone. The word lingered, but its meaning had shifted. I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet correction. "What works," I said softly, "is already written." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer uncertain. It was defined. Vanessa's arms dropped to her sides, her posture no longer defensive but unsettled, as though the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not control. Daniel looked between us, his expression thoughtful, conflicted, as if he were standing at a point where two paths diverged, and he could no longer pretend they led to the same place. I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing myself a small, measured breath, feeling the steadiness of it, the clarity that came with it. Because this moment was not about confrontation. It was not about raising my voice or proving a point. It was about something much quieter, something far more permanent. It was about standing still when everything around me expected me to move. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to step aside. The silence stretched between us, but it no longer felt uncertain or fragile. It felt settled, like something that had finally found its place after being ignored for far too long. Vanessa stood there for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on me as if she were searching for a crack, some hesitation, some sign that this was still a conversation she could control, but there was nothing left for her to find. She turned away first, her movements sharper now, less controlled. As she walked back toward the kitchen without another word, the quiet sound of a cabinet closing a little harder than necessary echoing through the house. Daniel remained where he was, his posture still, his expression unreadable at first, but slowly shifting into something more open, more aware, as though the distance between us, the one that had grown over years without either of us fully acknowledging it, was now visible to him in a way it had never been before. "Mom," he said after a moment, his voice lower, more careful than I had heard it in a long time. I looked at him, meeting his gaze without turning away, without softening what did not need to be softened. He hesitated, his hands moving slightly at his sides before settling again, as though he was unsure what to do with them, unsure of where he stood. "I thought," he began, then stopped, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could take shape. I did not finish it for him. I did not need to. "I know," I said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried everything he had not said, everything he had assumed, everything he was only now beginning to understand. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to mine. "I should have asked," he admitted, his voice steady but subdued, the certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to honesty. I held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. Because this moment was not about undoing what had already been done. It was about recognizing it, accepting it, learning from it, if he chose to. Vanessa's voice drifted in from the kitchen then, sharper now, less controlled, calling his name with a tone that suggested urgency, not partnership. Daniel glanced in that direction, then back at me, the conflict clear now, no longer hidden behind silence or avoidance. For a moment, he did not move. For a moment, he stood there between two choices, two directions, neither of which he could pretend were the same anymore. I did not tell him what to do. I did not guide him. I simply remained where I was, steady, present, allowing him to decide what came next on his own. He nodded slightly, almost to himself, then turned and walked toward the kitchen, his steps slower, more deliberate than before. I watched him go, not with disappointment, not with expectation, but with a calm understanding that some things take time, and some realizations cannot be forced. The house grew quiet again after that, the kind of quiet that settles after something has been said that cannot be taken back, something that changes the shape of everything that follows. I remained in the chair for a while longer, my hands resting lightly, my breathing steady, my thoughts clear. When I finally stood, I moved slowly through the house, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged in every room, in every space, in every memory held within those walls. I paused in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the bed, the dresser, the small details that had once felt fragile but now felt grounded again. Edward had not raised his voice. He had not confronted anyone. He had simply understood, and he had made sure that, when the time came, I would not have to fight to be seen. I walked back into the hallway, the soft light from the kitchen spilling out across the floor, the quiet murmur of voices continuing behind the walls, but I did not stop. I did not listen. I did not need to. Instead, I moved past it, toward the front of the house, toward the door, where I paused for just a moment, my hand resting lightly on the handle. Not to leave, not to escape, but to remind myself of something simple, something undeniable. I was not being pushed out. I was not being replaced. I was not being overlooked. I was still here. And for the first time in a very long time, that was not something anyone else could change.